I'll never forget the moment it happened, the exact second I realized my own family no longer saw me as a person, but as an obstacle in their way. One minute, I was sitting at the dinner table, proud to host another holiday in my home, and the next, I felt the sting of humiliation so sharp it cut deeper than anything I had faced in 70 years of life. It was my son, Daniel, and his wife, Melissa. People I loved more than anything, people I trusted. And yet, that night, the way they dismissed me in front of everyone, as though my voice didn't matter, as though I were some burden to be managed, it left me frozen in shock. I remember staring at their faces, searching for even a flicker of warmth or respect. But all I saw was annoyance, even irritation, like I had overstayed my welcome in their world. The worst part wasn't the words they used, it was the way they looked at me. My own son, who I raised with every ounce of strength I had, avoided my eyes, while Melissa smirked ever so slightly, satisfied that she had pushed me aside. And just like that, in the middle of what should have been a family gathering, I became invisible. My heart ached, not just from the cruelty of that moment, but from the realization that it wasn't sudden. This was the culmination of countless small dismissals, subtle digs, and moments when I was made to feel like I didn't belong in the very family I built. The humiliation of it all stung worse, because it came from the people I sacrificed most for. I sat there, silent, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. The chatter at the table went on as if nothing had happened. But inside me, something broke. I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind how quickly the love I poured into them had been forgotten, how easily they cast me aside. That night marked the beginning of a painful truth I could no longer ignore. And as much as it hurt, it forced me to look back at the life I had built, the sacrifices I had made, and the years I had given without hesitation. Because if I wanted to understand why this betrayal cut so deep, I had to remember everything I had poured into them. When I look back on my life, I see decades of quiet sacrifice woven into every choice I made. I married young, and for over 40 years, my husband and I built a life together brick by brick. We didn't have much in the beginning, but we had determination and faith in each other. We raised our son, Daniel, with the hope that he would have a better life than we did. Every long shift, every penny saved, every sleepless night with worry, it was all for him. When my husband passed away, everything changed. Suddenly, the weight of keeping the family steady fell entirely on my shoulders. Grief had hollowed me out, but I didn't let it consume me because my son needed me. I cooked, I cleaned, I kept the traditions alive. I showed up for every school play, every late-night study session, every scraped knee and broken heart. I was both mother and father, carrying roles that felt far too heavy at times. There were years when I denied myself small joys, new clothes, little trips, even dinners out because every dollar was stretched to cover what Daniel needed. College tuition, his first car, even help with rent when he was starting out at his job. I told myself it was worth it, that one day he'd look back and understand the sacrifices made to give him a foundation. And when he married Melissa, I tried to embrace her as best as I could. I told myself that families grow, that love is meant to expand, not shrink. Even when her sharp words stung or her smile felt thin, I chose patience, for the sake of peace, for the sake of my son, for the sake of the grandson who would one day call me grandma. But what I didn't realize at the time was how easily those sacrifices could be forgotten. How quickly love could be overshadowed by entitlement. Looking back, I can see the signs. Small moments where my generosity was treated not as a gift, but as an expectation. And those small moments were only the beginning. Looking back now, I realize the betrayal I felt that night didn't come out of nowhere. It was the final crack in a foundation that had been weakening for years. The signs were there all along, subtle, almost invisible at first, until they became impossible to ignore. It started small. Daniel would ask if I could cover little expenses here and there, promising to pay me back. A tank of gas when money was tight, a utility bill when work was slow. At first, I was happy to help. That's what family does. Right. But slowly, those one-time favors turned into habits. Repayments never came. Excuses became more polished, more practiced. Then came Melissa, with her careful suggestions that didn't feel like suggestions at all. She'd drop hints about needing new furniture, or talk about how hard it was to keep up with daycare costs. Somehow, those conversations always ended with me reaching for my checkbook, even when I hadn't planned to. I told myself it was just support, a way to lighten their load. But deep down, I noticed how quickly gratitude faded into expectation. There were other moments too. Times when my credit card would be borrowed for emergencies, only for me to later discover charges for things that were far from necessities. Or times when my time was taken for granted, watching their child for days at a stretch with barely a thank you, as though my life and my needs no longer mattered. At the time, I brushed it aside. I told myself it was just part of being a mother, part of being a grandmother. But each incident left a small bruise on my heart. Frustration began to simmer. A quiet resentment I didn't dare speak out loud. What I didn't know then was that these little abuses were leading me toward a moment I could no longer swallow in silence. A moment that would become my breaking point. The night everything finally snapped is etched into my memory like a scar. It was supposed to be a family dinner, one of those evenings where laughter fills the house and everyone feels at home. Instead, it turned into the moment I realized I couldn't let myself be treated this way anymore. I had spent the whole day preparing a meal from scratch. I stood on my feet for hours, seasoning the roast, mashing potatoes, and setting the table with care. By the time Daniel and Melissa arrived, I was exhausted but proud. I wanted them to feel welcome, to feel the warmth of family. But instead of gratitude, I got something else entirely. Melissa barely glanced at the food before criticizing how heavy it looked, as though my effort was nothing more than an inconvenience. Daniel joined in, making a comment about how maybe I should take it easy from now on. How hosting wasn't really something I should handle at my age. And then, right there in front of everyone, he suggested maybe next year they would take over holiday traditions at their home because it was time for a change. I sat there, stunned, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth. It wasn't just about the food, or the house, or the holiday. It was about being erased, about being told I no longer mattered in the very family I gave everything to. My face burned with humiliation, and for a moment I thought I might cry right there at the table. But then, something inside me shifted. The sadness turned to anger, and that anger ignited into something even stronger resolve. I realized in that moment that I had allowed myself to be diminished piece by piece, year after year, until there was almost nothing left of me in their eyes. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that it had to stop. I smiled politely, but in my heart, I was done. That dinner was the last time I would sit silently while my sacrifices were brushed aside. I decided then and there that I would take back my dignity. Quietly, without a word to anyone, I began to plan. After that dinner, I knew I couldn't go on pretending everything was fine. Outwardly, I smiled and went about my days as though nothing had changed. But inside, I was already laying the groundwork for a different future. I decided that if my family was going to treat me like I didn't matter, then it was time I reminded them of exactly who I was and what I was capable of. The first step was quiet observation. I started paying closer attention to their habits, their words, their slips of truth that used to go unnoticed. Melissa was careless at times, leaving papers out on the counter when she visited, or letting comments slip about how stretched their finances were. Daniel often mentioned plans that didn't quite add up, new purchases that didn't match the income he claimed to have. For years, I had taken these things at face value, but now I began to collect them, piece by piece, like fragments of a puzzle. I also revisited my own records. Every check I had written, every bill I had covered, every loan that was never repaid, I laid them out in front of me, a paper trail of generosity that had been twisted into expectation. Seeing it all in black and white filled me with equal parts sorrow and strength. Sorrow for the years I had allowed myself to be taken advantage of, but strength in knowing I now had proof of the truth I carried. And then, almost by accident, I stumbled on something bigger. Melissa had mentioned a family investment they were eager to announce soon, and when I dug a little deeper, I realized they were planning to tie my name to it, to use my assets and reputation as leverage, without my consent. That discovery was the spark I needed. They weren't just dismissing me emotionally. They were ready to exploit me financially, too. Instead of breaking me, that knowledge fueled me. I felt my power returning with every note I wrote, every document I copied, every plan I set into motion. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving their demands, I was preparing to turn the tables. And I knew the day was coming soon when I would no longer be silent. The day finally came when my patience and my preparation were about to meet. Daniel and Melissa arrived with the kind of energy that told me they had already decided how things would go. They didn't ask, they announced. They strolled into my home, dropping bags on the floor as if it belonged to them. Their voices carrying entitlement so loud, it made the walls feel smaller. Melissa started first, casually outlining who would stay in which room, as though she were assigning hotel suites. She mentioned that her parents would naturally need the master bedroom, since I wouldn't mind giving it up for their comfort. Daniel chimed in, noting how convenient it would be for me to handle the meals since I knew the kitchen better than anyone. It was all delivered with a practiced kind of politeness, the kind that hides arrogance beneath a thin veil of family obligation. For a few moments, I simply nodded, letting them believe their words carried weight. But inside, my heart was steady, almost calm. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I excused myself and returned with a folder I had carefully prepared. When I placed it on the table and slid it toward them, their smiles faltered. Inside were neatly printed invoices, itemized costs, and clear terms of accommodation. Room rates based on market value. Cleaning fees, damage deposits, optional meal services with pricing spelled out. I had even included comparison sheets from local hotels to prove how generous my numbers were. The silence that followed was almost sweet. Melissa's face drained of color as she realized this wasn't a joke. Daniel's eyes darted from page to page, searching for some loophole that didn't exist. For years, they had assumed my kindness was theirs to consume. Now, I had turned it into something undeniable business. I explained calmly that if they wanted to treat my home like a free resort, then it would be managed like one. Every guest had a cost, every service had a price, and unlike before, nothing would be left unspoken or unpaid. For the first time in a long time, I felt control settle back into my hands. I watched them stumble, their confidence cracking as the reality of my preparation set in. The power dynamic had shifted, and they knew it. But this was only the beginning, because as satisfying as it was to see their stunned faces, I also knew what would come next: the outrage, the chaos, the desperate scramble to regain control. And I was ready. The silence after I slid those invoices across the table didn't last long. It shattered like glass under the weight of their voices. Melissa was the first to erupt, her words tumbling over each other in outrage. She accused me of being cold, of valuing money over family, of destroying what was supposed to be a holiday gathering. Her voice rose so high it rattled through the walls, a desperate mix of anger and disbelief. Daniel wasn't much better. He paced the room, waving the papers in his hands as though they were weapons. He tried guilt first, reminding me of everything I'd done for him as a child, asking how I could now turn my back when he needed me. When guilt didn't work, he turned to anger. He accused me of being manipulated by bitterness, of letting age make me selfish. Each word cut, but none of them shook me. Even extended relatives chimed in, voices overlapping in a storm of accusations and pleas. Some tried reason, begging me to reconsider. Others went straight to insults, painting me as greedy and heartless. The room became a chorus of chaos-raised voices, frantic footsteps, the sound of papers hitting the table over and over. But through it all, I stayed calm. I sat in my chair with steady hands and an even voice, refusing to let their storms sweep me away. For the first time in years, I didn't bend, I didn't explain, I didn't apologize. I simply reminded them of the truth: family should never take advantage of one another. Boundaries were not cruelty. They were respect. The more I stayed composed, the more unhinged they became. It was as if my stillness was a mirror, forcing them to see themselves clearly, and they didn't like what they saw. In that chaos, I noticed something shift. Beneath the shouting, beneath the accusations, there was something else trying to break through. A deeper truth. A secret they hadn't planned on revealing, but one that was about to surface whether they wanted it to or not. Just when I thought the chaos couldn't get any louder, the truth slipped out. It didn't come in a dramatic confession or a shouted argument. It came in a trembling voice, almost drowned out by the noise. Melissa's facade cracked, and through her tears, the truth poured out. She admitted that the reason they had pushed so hard to use my home wasn't just entitlement. It was desperation. Their finances were in ruins. The investment they had bragged about, the one they had hinted would elevate the whole family, was a failure. They had lost almost everything. And now, they were scrambling to hide it. My home, my resources, my patience. They weren't luxuries to them. They were lifelines. For a moment, the air shifted. The anger, the shouting, it all dimmed under the weight of her words. I felt the shock wash over me. followed quickly by something I hadn't expected: empathy. All the arrogance, all the manipulation, it was a mask covering fear. They weren't trying to hurt me just for the sake of it. They were trying to survive, even if it meant stepping on me to do it. Daniel's silence told me everything. He didn't deny it. His shoulders slumped, his face pale. My strong, stubborn son, the one I had raised to be self-reliant, stood before me carrying a burden he had been too proud to share until the very last second. It didn't excuse the way they had treated me. It didn't erase the humiliation or the years of being taken for granted. But in that moment, I understood that this wasn't just about greed. It was about fear, pride, and poor choices snowballing into disaster. The bitterness in my heart softened, just slightly, because the truth was complicated. They had wronged me, yes, but they were also broken in ways I hadn't seen clearly until then. That clarity didn't erase the need for boundaries, it only made them more vital. As I sat there, absorbing the weight of their confession, I realized the next step wasn't about punishment. It was about teaching. It was about showing them and myself that strength comes not from being used, but from standing firm. And that was the lesson I was finally ready to share. In the quiet that followed their confession, something shifted between us. The shouting had drained away, replaced by an uneasy stillness. For once, I didn't feel like the weakest voice in the room. I felt like the anchor. My boundaries had drawn a line none of them could ignore. And strangely, it was that line that began to change the air in the room. Melissa's anger softened into something closer to humility. Daniel avoided my eyes at first, but I could sense the weight of respect starting to replace his defensiveness. Even the relatives who had hurled insults earlier grew quieter, as though realizing they had witnessed something important. A woman they thought they could dismiss standing firm for herself at last. I didn't gloat. I didn't lecture. I simply told them the truth that love is not about letting yourself be used. That family is not about taking until someone has nothing left to give. It's about balance, respect, and recognizing that even the strongest shoulders eventually need rest. For years, I believed silence was kindness. I thought patience and sacrifice were enough to keep peace. But silence had cost me pieces of myself, and patience had been mistaken for weakness. That night, I learned that real love requires boundaries, because without them, even the deepest bonds can turn into chains. I walked away from that evening not bitter, but lighter. I knew not everything was fixed. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight. But for the first time, I believed that maybe things could change, not because they wanted them to, but because I demanded it. And in that moment, I respected myself in a way I hadn't in years. If you've ever been made to feel small, if your sacrifices have been forgotten, I want you to hear this. You are not wrong for expecting respect. You are not selfish for setting boundaries. And sometimes, the bravest act of love you can give your family is to finally stand up for yourself. Thank you for listening to my story. If any part of this spoke to you, I'd love for you to share your own experiences in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Your voice matters, and it deserves to be heard.